I'm honored to be able to talk about the Tempest with you today. Please, any questions? Anytime we'll have some time for discussion, but if I'm saying something that you are moved to make a comment, just don't hesitate to stick up your hand and we'll have a conversation. I'm going to start with Montaigne. This is the subject is Shakespeare and Utopia. I don't know of any evidence that he read Thomas More's Utopia, which was available in the earlier part of the 16th century. So he could have, but there's no trace of that. He did know Thomas More's contributions to the story of the life of Richard III. He was in fact alive as a youngster living in the house of Cardinal Morton when those events took place, and there are some first-hand accounts that come across as truly authentic. But it's interesting that he didn't pick up on Thomas More's Utopia. Of course, Thomas More was a Catholic. That posed a kind of a problem for people who regarded that plus or minus in those terms during those troubled years. But Shakespeare certainly knew the essays of Montaigne. Montaigne was a man of the same time. He published the essays about 1580 and then a few years thereafter. So they were available to Shakespeare. They're available in a translation by John Florio in 1603. And I'm picking up on that because Montaigne's essay about on the cannibals is remarkably apropos and treats on a subject that really points in the direction of Utopia, though he doesn't use that term. I'd like to begin by reading for you a passage out of Montaigne and then comparing it with a part of Shakespeare's play, because they're remarkably similar, in fact so much so that it looks like plagiarism. There's almost word for word for a while. Of course, Shakespeare transforms it by his dramatic sense of how this fits into the rest of the play. It's true elsewhere, there are a few others like this. There's a passage from Antony and Cleopatra where Enobarbus is talking about Cleopatra meeting Antony on the River Nile. The barge she sat in like a burnished throne burned on the water, purple the sails, and so on. That's almost word for word out of Plutarch. And it's a very good example of the same thing, because at first glance it looks like plagiarism, but if you look at it in context, in Plutarch, it's the author speaking. He's developing his point of view about Cleopatra, that she was some piece of work, but she was dangerous and she ruined the life of Mark Antony. It's an moral object lesson for how a noble Roman ruined his own life by chasing after this remarkable woman. In Antony and Cleopatra, the play by Shakespeare, it's put in the mouth of Enobarbus, who was Antony's favorite follower and deeply loyal, and loving Egypt and reveling in Egypt, but also worried about things as increasingly the way his master's behaving. So it's a much more subtle approach to how that fits into the dramatic context of voice talking to voice, Egypt talking to Rome, and so on. So that's true here. The Tempest. It comes up in Act 2. At the point at which the Neapolitan group, this includes Antonio, who stole the dukedom away from his brother Prospero in Milan, and Sebastian, with whom, and Alonso from Naples, with whom Antonio teamed up in order to be able to take over in Milan, with the ruler who was a wonderful man and very learned, but not paying a lot of attention to day-to-day operations, let this palace coup occurred. And there's an old man named Gonzalo who's with them, who's very important for the story too, isn't he? Because he's the person, when Antonio succeeded in this coup d'etat in Milan some 12 years ago, he put Prospero and his infant daughter in a boat. And it was a boat that, as the description indicates, it was such a leaky vessel that the rats had instinctively quit it already. So it was clearly meant to be a form of murder, that the ship would go sail out of the harbor maybe and then go down, and that would be the end of Prospero. Of course, they reached the island of the Tempest instead. But in Act 1, Scene 2, when Prospero is finally laying before his daughter the story of her life and how they came to the island and what happened back in Milan in those dark days of political overthrow, he describes how a kindly old man named Gonzalo really saved their lives. He's the one who put provision, food and water in the boat and something to eat, and also, no less importantly, Prospero's books. So they owe everything to Gonzalo, whom they haven't seen this whole time, of course, because they've been on the island all this time alone with Caliban, but without any Italians. The Italians are, the reason they're there now, isn't it, that they have sailed to Carthage, basically, to North Africa for the wedding of Alonso's daughter, and they're on their way back when a storm comes up, and they are shipwrecked on the island of the Tempest. And we learn shortly in the course of the play that the Tempest, of course, was designed and engineered and overseen by Prospero himself with the help of Ariel, so that in fact nobody was hurt, and all the sailors on the ship were safely brought into port. But in the process, he did cast all Alonso and Sebastian, Antonio, and Gonzalo into the seawater, and they swam ashore, assuming, among other things, that Alonso's son Ferdinand has drowned in the event. The way these Neapolitans greet the island is very interesting, isn't it? They're especially Sebastian and Antonio, who are the villains of the piece. Antonio most of all, the brother of Prospero, the younger brother who usurped his dukedom. They're very sarcastic about their prospects. This looks like a dismal place. There are no inhabitants visible. They don't know what they're going to do about this, but in the process, they think about, tell the story about the journey there and the marriage of the daughter at Tunis. But all of this prompts old Gonzalo, whom the rest of them view as an old fuddy-dud, a kind of a Polonius figure, verbal, loquacious, but meandering, and they view him as a kind of a fool, but he's given a chance to meditate on where they are. And he says, "Had I the plantation of this isle, my lord," Antonio in his verses of Mark says that he would plant nettle seed. The other says, or docks or mallows. And Gonzalo goes on, and we're the king on it, what would I do? Well, you see how this is setting up something very like the island of Utopia, or more particularly the essay about the cannibals.
He goes on, "In the Commonwealth I would by contraries execute all things. For no kind of traffic would I admit, no name of magistrate. Letters should not be known. Riches, poverty, use of service, none. Contract, succession, born, bound of land, tilth, vineyard, none. No use of metal, corn or wine or oil, no occupation, all men idle, and women too, but innocent and pure, no sovereignty." At this point, Sebastian interverses and said, yes, he would be king on it, which is well observed, but he goes, "And all things in common," this is Gonzalo again, "all things in common nature should produce without sweat or endeavor, treason, felony, sword, pike, knife, gun, or need of any engine would I not have, but nature should bring forth of its own kind all poison, all abundance to feed my innocent people."
Well, here's the passage from Montaigne's essay on of the cannibals, which is in the translation by Florio, 1603. "It is a nation, I would answer Plato, that hath no kind of traffic, no knowledge of letters, no intelligence of numbers, no name of magistrates, nor of politic superiority, nor use of service, of riches or of poverty, no contract, no successions, no dividences, no occupation, but idle, no respect of kindred but common, no apparel but natural, no manuring of lands, no use of wine, corn, or metal, the very words that import lying, falsehood, treason, dissimulation, covetousness, enmity, destruction, and pardon were never heard amongst them." You see how very close the language is, it's image by image, word by word. So, but setting aside this interesting little diversion about what we would call plagiarism, but see how well Shakespeare is adapting this scene to the moment in the play. What does it point to in terms of ideas about the island, about Utopia? What Montaigne is doing is, of course, basically polemical. He's an essayist, and Shakespeare is a dramatist, and thereby hangs a significant difference, of course, about the way in which this material is used again, as with Shakespeare and Plutarch. But Montaigne's point is going to, this happens in Utopia too. You go off to a far-off land, something off the coast of, say, South America. Utopia seems to be set in a place like Trinidad. The island of the Tempest is somewhere in the Bermudas are mentioned at one point as one of the possible sites, or certainly inspirations for this story. You know, the shipwreck in the Bermudas that Shakespeare was familiar with. So the location is very similar, and what Montaigne wants to do with this is to imagine what would happen if somehow people were able to start up a society and devise things for the best intent of all the people involved there, without regard to any form of model, because there are people who didn't, in this case, don't have any model. And they have a king called Utopus. This is, again, rather like Plato in the Republic, of course, the ultimate source of all of this. And that the king really beneficently authorizes them to set up a community where communities will be located ideally the correct distance from each other, so there'll be a sufficient amount of land around each city or town to be able to provide sustenance and occupation, and they work out a system of governance under these circumstances that is basically rather communal. I get a chance to teach this down at the Gleacher Center. It's wonderful because it's a text that obviously brings up all one's preoccupations and indeed neuroses about communism. It is a communal world and so on. And I hear a lot of sermonizing about how what Thomas More is ventriloquizing here is not going to work. Yes, please.
Excuse me for interrupting. Could you make your microphone just a teeny bit louder?
I will certainly be happy to try to do that. Good. Let me move it a little bit further. And is that perhaps better? I don't know. I can do this. Is that better?
It is.
Okay. Thank you. The island of Utopia, and in this case what Montaigne is looking to develop, is a world which people, without any preconceptions at all about how governance, political organizations, sexual relationships between people, what the purpose of marriage is, the purpose of religion, all of these things, how are they developed ab ovo, without any prior knowledge of how this would be done, just according to ideas of what serves best. By the way, what I tend to counter when I teach this down at the Gleacher Center is to say, well, the model really is not anything like we would know as communists. It's really monasticism. That Thomas More himself had an experience with being in a monastic community. He gave that up. He realized he didn't have a calling, but he was a very loyal Catholic, and he was really much enamored of the idea that in such a community that you live in complete brotherhood, and you do have forms of government. You choose who gets to be the head of the organization, abbot, and so on, but it's all done in a kind of a democratic way, and it is meant to serve the purposes of the community without any prior knowledge or modeling on monarchical structures in Western Europe. So what Montaigne does is to regard this as a way of looking back on Europe as, and Thomas More does the same, as a searching critique of the way people do things in England and France especially, but on the continent as well, mostly England and France. One thing that's interesting to say about Montaigne as the writer of this wonderful essay, which I highly recommend to you, he's not an anthropologist. He's not really interested. He didn't pursue any information. He didn't have a way of getting much information about natives in the New World. There were some people occasionally brought over during this period, and people were very curious to see them, of course, in London or such places, or in France. But that's not Montaigne's bill of fare, to try to figure out what's happening among these people, or how they did this, or whether this is whether it varies from other tribes and so on, right? He's not an anthropologist. He's there, he devises this as a way of sort of whipping Europe in terms of its own cultural fixations and obsessions. And Thomas More is doing very much the same thing. That's an interesting point. I don't know there's any evidence that Montaigne was aware of Thomas More either. But this is an idea that's partly just growing during the 16th century across Western Europe, partly because it was an age of discovery to the New World, and so that was the thing to think about. You get people, Spanish, but English increasingly too, and French going colonizing or exploiting in the New World and so on. What was this place like, and what would it suggest about possible ways of improving one's societal social structure? And that goes back to Plato as well. The fantasy there is that you go across the Atlantic, you will run into this marvelous world where if you get far enough away, you'll get to India and be able to pick up jewels off the beach and so on. And what would that be like? Well, what both Montaigne and Thomas More come to is, when you look at it that way, it's a matter of perspective, going to a far-off imaginary place and looking back at Europe and saying, this is the way they do things. And what is the answer? Well, kings gather around them cadres of courtiers who have nothing better to do than fight with each other or fight other people and so on. So you get immense quarreling, struggle for position and so on, and political overthrows. And who needs that? You get, and England was suffering from a lot from this currently, you get extremes of contrast of poverty and wealth, very timely for our consideration today. And that was partly owing to the enclosure of land, which was especially heavy in England, that people who owned a lot of land, that included the clergy. Thomas More, as a good Catholic, is able to be very caustic about the way wealthy church owners and owners of big estates, monastic establishments, were able to exploit land by discovering that the cheaper thing to do is not to farm it out for individual people to grow crops on the small tillages and so on, but in fact to enclose it and convert it to sheep. They could get wool and export that, and they made scads of money out of that. But it meant, of course, displacing people who had been, through the medieval period, had been used to and depended upon being able to be tenant farmers on the lands of people who were above them in the social structure. All that was seriously decaying. It's to Henry VIII's credit that his government regarded this as a social problem, and they invade against it. They try to get people not to do this, but they didn't really understand the social underpinnings, what was causing this, and so on, the economic forces that were driving this, and so they didn't get very far. So enclosure remained a very serious problem. Crime, very interesting debate, especially in Thomas More, about how, well, it's a debate we have out today. Is crime something that the thing to do is to lock as many people up, get them off the streets who are pickpockets or drug peddlers or whatever committing? If you get them all off the streets, then we ought to be able to get rid of crime, right? And so the other answer, of course, is no, you should worry about the causes of crime in poverty. And so that Utopia is really very advanced in all of that. And it makes for a wonderful read. There are also lengthy discussions, especially in More's Utopia, about marriage, about how men and women ought to be able to be brought together. Famously, Thomas More proposes, his spokesperson in Utopia, Raphael, proposes that it would be nice for a young man and a young woman to be able to see each other naked, to see what they're getting into, as it were. And that shocked a lot of people. Another wonderful shocking image that they have no use for gold. They get away from the gold standard to an extreme that gold, they can find no other use for gold than to make chamber pots out of gold. So you can see the tenor of the kind of satirical approach to it, but obviously deeply serious that England, France, the Western Europe, suffering from serious endemic social problems, and how refreshing in this age of discovery to imagine a place in some distant land where you can look back and see how badly Europe has modeled and to come at least to the conclusion that this doesn't have to be the only way you can try to organize society or talk about marriage and other social events, right? So let's take this back to the Tempest via this speech of dear old Gonzalo talking to his fellow Neapolitans. Well, what Shakespeare does, and this is again sort of characteristic of him as a dramatist, it's a wonderful idea but he subjects it immediately to a crossfire of satirical comment by Antonio and Sebastian particularly, who of course are villains. They're already identifiable as villainous people. Antonio was the one who did seize the dukedom from his brother and so on, and their caustic insertions, especially, I read this just a moment ago, when Gonzalez says that if I were king on this land, now he's thinking, I suppose, about somebody like Utopus, who was somewhat in the model of the ancient Greek 5th century and 6th century BC, going back to Solon and the great figures of, and the image of Theseus and so as rulers who would be generous this way and support the setting up of a new form of government. At any rate, Gonzalez says, well, if I were king on it, I would do this, and one of them intersperses, yet he would be king on it, remind us of that. And the other one says, the latter end of his commonwealth forgets the beginning. So they introduce a note, at least in a way of saying that this is a dream, it's a fantasy, by someone who's represented as rather old and really impractical, and is not one of the people who moves and shakes things and seizes power and so on. He's a philosopher, and we have that difference between philosophers and people who can do things practically, right? So immediately we see that this is an image of a better world, but is it possible? So it's interesting to think about the Tempest in those terms, I think, of Shakespeare's own example of wanting to imagine an island off the coast of some place in the New World across the Atlantic Ocean, and using it as a way of looking back on customs, practices, and political structures in England. Not, again, he doesn't want to do this from a polemical point of view. He's not writing an essay. He's definitely not an essayist. He's creating a drama out of all of this, but it is one that certainly does want to bring to light at least some of the contradictions and ambiguities about what to think of the way we do things in England in the time of by now, Queen Elizabeth. Well, let's take marriage as one model. This is marriage and courtship, the relationship between young men and women and the desire to have a family. This is a wonderful way in which in the Tempest, young Prospero is paired off against Caliban as a potential mate for Miranda, right? Because Miranda, the daughter there, she's grown up now just with her father as a companion, and she now, we learn, and we'll look at that passage in a moment, she's had a moment when, a bad moment, when Caliban, who presumably has reached puberty, doesn't use those terms and so on, but it's obviously that's what's happened, he attempts to rape Miranda, and she will have, of course, none of it, and I take it that our sympathies are very strongly urged against that all should be her choice, and this is a rape, or an attempted rape, whatever we're to think of his motives. But it's interesting to the extent to which the play wants to make Caliban a sympathetic figure. That's often noted that people respond to this play in the theater or as you're reading it. He has some of the best poetry in the play when he describes the isle is full of noises, and he's the one who lives on this island because he knows how to live there. He lives in a state of natural being. He knows where the fresh brine pits are and where to get shellfish off the shore and so on. But they use him that way. That's one of the things that's so amazing about this story, of course, that it really sounds for all the world like what happened with the English colonists, especially when they settled in the New World and had to find out what to do with the Indians. In general, the relations at first were good, and the Indians were rather admiring, somewhat awed in many cases, and willing to help and show people how to grow corn and things like that in the New World. And then something would go wrong, and it would turn into an incident, and there would be blood spilled, and the relations would be entirely broken down. Did Shakespeare know anything about that, or is he intuiting that this is what's going to happen on the island of the Tempest when Caliban, being there all alone, is brought in to be, and then he becomes a servant? Now that's an interesting point about Caliban, is he's described in the plays, mostly through the conversation of Miranda and her father, as a devil. He's called a deformed slave in the set of dramatist personae in the play. At one point, they declare that he is the son of this witch who came to the island and bore this child there, and she was Sycorax, and she was banished to the island from the civilized world because of something unspeakable she did. The play doesn't even say what it was. It was so bad that she really, without a name, she had to be banished. But she is pregnant, and probably it's her pregnancy that spared her being executed. So she comes and bears a child on the island. The story we get is that at first Miranda and Caliban played together. They were only companion. This was indeed, she makes that point several times, this was the only male of her own age that she knew. And in fact, there's a kind of ambiguity in the play about whether she considers him human or not. Right? At one point, when she's counting the number of men she's seen in her life, she says, well, and so she'll say, there's my father and Caliban, I suppose. But until I saw Ferdinand, I'd never seen another human being. And one time, in one of her accounts, she's counting Caliban on that list, and another not. So I think the play is exploring that interesting ambiguity as to whether someone like Caliban could be considered part of the human race. But he's very sympathetic, not only in the way in which he describes the beauties of the island, but he seems to have enjoyed being with the family. They were playmates together, and then this episode occurs. Now let's look at that. It's Prospero who says to him, thou
a lying slave whose stripes may move not kindness, I have used thee, filth as thou art, with humane care, and lodged thee in mine own cell, till thou dost seek to violate the honor of my child. To which Caliban replies, oh, would I had been dumb, thou didst prevent me. I had people else this isle with Calibans. And at that point, Miranda turns on him, although this is something textual crux. It's a long speech in which she describes how he is brutish and incapable of learning anything good. It's a speech that sometimes is sounded Prospero, it sounds perhaps a bit more like him, but it's also quite plausible that she's, even though she doesn't say a lot of this, she remembers certainly that moment with a great deal of dread and distaste. So,
wide disagreement, of course, about whether that was viable or not. It's interesting that Caliban is unreconstructed about this. He says, now, some years later, oh ho, when it had been done, I would have peopled the isle of the little Calibans. And that's very nice because he's making the point that the purpose of their being, me Tarzan, you Jane, would be that they would have children and populate the island, which needs doing. He's come here, he's all alone in terms of his own race or people, whatever that is, and he doesn't see the harm in it. He's completely unrepentant in his attempt to have seized her physically and sexually. Because why? And it's presented, I think, in the play as a kind of a natural man, isn't it? This is procreative. It's described not as abstract lust, and Shakespeare is very capable of portraying that as a very ugly thing. This is portrayed almost as innocent, at least in Caliban's own terms. As his body changed, the instinct brought him forward to want to people the isle with little Calibans. So that's
of course very heavily rejected by
Prospero and Miranda. And let's consider the alternative, which is Ferdinand. Now that seems like an extraordinarily contrastive comparison, isn't it? But the play is very careful to compare them in various ways. Not only is Ferdinand the only other male of her age with whom she's ever come in contact or with whom she sees during the course of the play, when he comes ashore and runs into her father and her, the father behaves very strangely from the daughter's point of view, rebukes her for paying any attention to him, and tells the young man to behave himself, and loads him on with chains and says, you're going to have to carry wood, turns into a slave. for the benefit of their household. Well, that's exactly what's happened with Caliban. That's what he does, is carry wood, among other. So there are various instances where we see that Ferdinand and Caliban, as unlike as they are made into the two alternative choices for Miranda. Now this is where I want to make this point about what going to the New World, looking back on the custom of marriage, the way it holds the custom of marriage up to an interestingly kind of skeptical, contrastive point of view. Well, Ferdinand and Miranda are much more conventional, of course, and here we see a plot in which Prospero, being very much the master of ceremonies in this play, the controller, the magician who creates the storm, puts people in the sea and brings them ashore in different places, landering in different spots. We understand that he's worked out a whole scheme whereby Ferdinand will be separated from his father and the others, partly so that he can put Alonso, the father, through a test of believing, as he is forced to do throughout the course of the play, that he's lost his son, and to see this as a kind of a punishment of Providence for the terrible thing he did in assisting this overthrow in Milan, right? And then the other purpose of separating Ferdinand from the rest of the group and bringing him alone is that, of course, the wonderful scene in which he comes on shore and runs right into Miranda and Ferdinand. We know who's plotted that. It is Prospero who arranged not just that this generally would happen, but the actual timing and the location, how the thing would occur. So that scene reads with a wonderful irony. Prospero is there watching something that he's set up. So an interesting question becomes, why is he so wary about his daughter's engagement with Ferdinand? He's obviously, for one thing, it's going to be the perfect political union, isn't it? It is by the end of the play. There's been this political rebellion, overthrow of Milan by people coming from the assistance from Naples. If you can marry the son of the King of Naples to Prospero's heir apparent as the Duke of Milan, they will be uniting of these two formerly warring kingdoms, and their issue will be part of the united kingdom of Milan and Naples. So it's perfect, and that's the way it works out. But that's remarkable. It is, if there ever was an arranged marriage, this is an arranged marriage from that point of view, right? And of course, that was very common during the period. You get Henry VII marrying one of his daughters to King James IV of Scotland, his son Arthur being married to Catherine of Aragon. That was the way princes negotiated treaties and relationships between countries that might otherwise be at war with each other and so on. So everybody would understand that. So that's what Prospero was doing in those terms. At the same time, it is Shakespeare's locus classicus of a romantic love affair, right? Young boy meets girl, and they look at each other across the dunes or whatever, and they just love enters their eyes. It's like Midsummer Night's Dream. That's one of the nice things about this play. It's it has no direct sources other than these little glimpses at Montaigne and some accounts of sea voyage and wrecks and so on, and the discovery of the Bermudas. There's no plot behind the Tempest, as there for almost every other play he wrote. Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, and so on, and all the history plays and so on. The very few exceptions include Midsummer Night's Dream, which has essentially a rather original plot, one or two others, and then The Tempest, which is a new plot. But it's also, of course, a very familiar plot, right? It ends with marriage, it has the love story in the back of it, but around it accrues various other nice motifs about political struggle and political overthrow, all of which are going to be resolved by the happy ending of the play. So Shakespeare's sort of pulling out all the stops that he's become so familiar with as a great playwright. This is the sort of things he just wakes up in the morning and he does it effortlessly. It's his colleagues evidently regarded this as a kind of a showpiece. And to me, it's very attractive to the familiar idea that this was Shakespeare's swan song, 1611 or 13, that he retired from the theater. He went on writing one or two more plays at that point, but mostly collaborating with John Fletcher, writing The Two Noble Kinsmen. Of Henry VIII appears to have been a collaboration all with Fletcher, who was a successor at the King's Men, so he was breaking in the younger man. Very nice thing for him to have done, but also very appropriate for someone who is in retirement. So there's nothing that says that directly, that the Tempest is a retirement play, but it reads beautifully that way. Among other things, to get back to Shakespeare's colleagues, Hemmings and Condell, who edited the folio in 1623, they chose to put the Tempest first in that volume. And it's not first of any sort of order of play, it's quite the opposite. It's about the last thing. Why start with the Tempest? Well, this is sort of your quintessential distillation of everything that Shakespeare does beautifully, especially with comedy, right? And they even went to the trouble of having it copied, especially by Ralph Crane, a scribe who did several plays for them and so on, and made especially careful copies, so that there are very few typographical problems in editing the Tempest. There was only one text, and it's almost without problems. So that's all in back of this idea that the Tempest is a kind of a swan song for Shakespeare, but a wonderful occasion then for him to reflect on, go back to the Utopian motif of contrasted views about sexuality, contrasted views about marriage. On the one hand, the European model, and that seems to be privileged in the play. It obviously is, plot-wise, that the story ends with the not quite marriage yet of Ferdinand and Miranda. They're going to, it's not quite clear actually, they really need to go to church, and there's no church available before this marriage will be completely sanctified, but obviously they are totally engaged, and Prospero puts on a beautiful mask for them to celebrate the values that go with chastity and honor. And now let's look at another motif that's very strong there, and wonderfully in that moment of the play. This is as the play where the mask is about to be put on in the fourth act. Prospero, he's presenting it to his son-in-law, prospective son-in-law, and to his daughter as a kind of gift for their impending marriage. And he says, mostly to Ferdinand, he says, "Then is my gift of thine own acquisition worthily purchased with my daughter." That's a nice note, isn't it? There's reflecting this notion that the father owns the daughter, and it is his to give to the younger man. That is the gesture. This is, very, very strong until recently, especially in the Anglican service. Who giveth this woman? The father comes forward. Well, that doesn't happen much anymore. It seems a little bit wrong in terms of our own mores about father-daughter relationships or the father's position in marriage of a daughter. But it was very much the standard, of course, in Britain in the 16th century by Archbishop Cranmer in the Prayer Book. So this is that same view that a daughter has the right to, as much as he wants to do it right and make sure that she's going to be happy. Again, it's a trick of art, isn't it? It's just stunning to watch. That on the one hand, it's a totally arranged marriage. On the other hand, he wants to make sure that they will really fall in love and be perfect for each other, and he seems to manage both. But in the process, he also wants to complicate that falling in love because he doesn't want it to go too fast. And he keeps making that point. That's the reason he enchains Ferdinand and makes him carry wood and so on. It's time for... So we get traditional European, especially English values about marriage, especially that of the Anglican Church during this time, which was taking marriage much more seriously as a really wonderful validation of what sexuality ought to be about. That is, yes, sexuality, the Roman Church had been pretty much down on sexuality throughout most of the Middle Ages, especially in the monastic communities, but the Anglican Church wanted to move direction, saying this is a sacrament that can actually be quite beautiful, and sexuality can be a beautiful part of it, so long as it is, you don't get this without marriage. And that's very strong also, by the way, in Utopia, right? The penalties in Thomas More's Utopia against violating that sense that Thomas More makes it more of a joke. It's really his idea is, why is it that we have this really strict injunction that the man and woman should not know each other sexually until they marry? It's because the man would never give in for such a stupid arrangement if he were able to get sexual pleasure without paying the price of being married. Shakespeare doesn't go in that direction of seeing it in that sort of sardonic vein, but he does, and we don't know, of course, what Shakespeare himself thought, but for his audience, London people watching these plays, many of whom were quite Puritan, even rather liberal Protestant in their inclination, some of them puritanical and so on, but this is really as they liked it in terms of ideas about sexuality and marriage. So So this is what, for example, in Act 4, Scene 1, what Prospero says, that as my gift and thine own acquisition worthily purchased, take my daughter. But if thou dost break her virgin knot before all sanctimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite be ministered, no sweet aspersion shall the heavens let fall to make this contract grow, but barren hate, sour-eyed disdain, and discord shall bestrew the union of your bed with weeds so loathly that you shall hate it both. Therefore take heed, as Hymen's lamps shall light you. Very strong sermon about no sexuality without marriage first. Ferdinand replies as follows: as I hope for quiet days, fair issue, and long life, with such love as 'tis now, the murkiest den, the most opportune place, the strongest suggestion our worser genius can, shall never melt my honor into lust to take away the edge of that day's celebration, when I shall think where Phoebus' steeds are foundered or night kept chained below. On the one hand, he's saying there's nothing in the world that would force me into violating my oath here that I'm going to honor her chastity and wait until we are man and wife in the eyes of the church. And he goes immediately on to say, and the day when we're married will be the longest day in my life. And I'm waiting for that moment when we can actually climb into bed together. It's just a wonderful way of seeing, honoring sexuality in a rather amusing way, but it has to be ordered this way according to reason over passion. All these great commonplaces about how the human psyche should work on such things. Isn't that? And then the mask makes it such a celebratory thing, and so on. So that marriage is in many ways perhaps the most elaborately triumphant marriage in all of Shakespeare's comedies. I can't think of another where it's given this much space and this much also vocabulary and description, tying it specifically to the idea of marriage before sex, to celebrate this idea of what marriage is. And it's set in the play against the opposite of Caliban, who remains completely impenitent about the idea he tried to seize her and start a family, or at least a lot of offspring on the island. So, getting along the model of Montaigne and Thomas More, Shakespeare, with his genius at dramatic confrontation, sets up a debate in this play about what we from Western Europe are to think about sexuality and place of marriage in it. And what I take it in these terms is that Shakespeare really has an uncanny way of having his cake and eating it too. And on the one hand, it does set up a sense of, as in Montaigne and Thomas More, it's very good to go off to a distant point, but look back and decide, are we really doing this thing right? And what about this contrary view that sexuality has a kind of purpose in the natural world of procreating? But then to settle finally in the play, at least the major chords in terms of the structure, the way the play comes together in its finale, and is to say yes, what Ferdinand and Miranda represent is really quite lovely. That's also true, of course, isn't it, about political strife. Let's look at that a little bit. Yes, please. Good. Thanks. Thank you, Mark. Talk about political strife. Interesting motif in this play of a brother, a younger brother especially, taking away the throne, or the dukedom, from his older brother in an unconscionable coup d'etat. Fascinating how often this happens in Shakespeare. It happens in As You Like It, for example, where Duke Senior is run out of town into the forest by Duke Frederick, his younger brother, who repents at the very end of the play and decides to become a kind of a monastic, but right to the last moment is prepared to invade the Forest of Arden and take things back from Duke Senior. It happens in Hamlet, of course, very prominently, that Claudius kills his older brother for the throne and for the queen. And it just, brothers are often after each other this way in terms of Shakespeare. And again, it strikes me as significant that in Shakespeare's capstone play, his Summa of the kind of things he does in the theater, that he makes a major chord of this play, a story about the enmity between brothers. I'm leaving out King Lear, but let me not leave out King Lear in this quick survey of possible models here. The story of Edmund and Edgar in King Lear, of course, is a notorious instance of this, perhaps the most threatening and terrifying in all of Shakespeare. And one interesting sidelight about this, I've never known what to do with this, and I don't know of any Shakespeare scholar who has known what to do with it. Shakespeare had a younger brother named Edmund. Okay? Why did he choose the name of Edmund for the villain in King Lear? The names are not in his original source for this, which is Don Quixote by Cervantes. But in fact, a lot of the names there were invented and so on. Why did he choose that name and then have Edgar and Edmund so much alike? So let's go back to the Tempest and the conflict between Antonio and Prospero. It's again, what's common to this model is, as in As You Like, for example, that the one who is overthrown is more gentle, more generous, more philosophical, and too much so. That's suggested perhaps in Hamlet too, that the sweet king who's murdered by his brother, sleeping in his orchard and so on, doesn't have enough of a security guard. He isn't looking out for his own physical welfare against, obviously, a man who should not be trusted. I'm skipping over Much Ado About Nothing, where you have a similar story between Don John and his older brother Don Pedro in Much Ado About Nothing. In each case, it's a case where it's someone who is a little bit guileless and a wonderful philosophical person, but somewhat inattentive to the day-to-day business of ruling. You get, in Hamlet, you see the reverse, which is that Claudius, the villain of the play, but what a superb diplomat he is. What a superb politician. He knows how to drop people's names every time he talks to them, how to slap them on the back, how to do favors for them, to give them exit visa for their sons to go abroad. He collects IOUs the way LBJ was so good at doing, for example, in terms of our recent history. And it's just admirable if you're looking for a model who knows what a politician is supposed to do. Curiously, I think it's been part of the sort of frustration a lot of people about President Obama at the moment. He doesn't do enough of that. We want him to be more like Bill Clinton and slap people on the back and play golf together and so on. And he's rather more cerebral, right? And that's a problem with Prospero. He has his books and he's not watching what's going on. And in fact, the play's description is quite clear what it is that Antonio does during those months or years prior to the usurpation. This is all in the past that we know it's not staged, but the way it's described is that Antonio, since his brother was happy to preside but let someone else, namely his brother, run things, the day-to-day operation, it gives him a chance of collecting IOUs, doing things for people, having his door open and answering his telephone. And he's very good at that. And when the time comes, the coup is quite effortless. That's true in Hamlet. Claudius doesn't go about killing his brother, the elder Hamlet, until he's quite sure that he can swing this whole thing, which means not only getting the queen, but of course getting the throne. How's he going to get the throne when the elder Hamlet has a son named Hamlet who's down in Wittenberg, but is clearly old enough to be considered for king? It's an elective monarchy, but even so, he would have to be a primary candidate. And Claudius is just canny enough to know how to play up to people like Polonius, people who are going to vote on this, the electors who will choose the next king when Hamlet Sr. dies. So again, Shakespeare's pulling together in this last summation, this play, a picture about the difference between, in a philosopher-king dialogue, a dilemma between the philosopher and the king, right? And so Prospero is a great magician, but there is evidence that he wasn't tending to the day-to-day. What's it going to be like at the end of the play? That's a nice little note, isn't it? What happens at the end of the Tempest? They're going to leave Caliban on the island. Caliban is somewhat chastened about all of this. He realizes that getting involved in that plot with Stefano and Trinculo to overthrow Prospero was a fool's errand, that they were, that's another interesting note about colonization, isn't it? That they, Stefano and Trinculo, especially Stefano, has a lot of rum in barrels, and he knows what he can do with that, which is to slosh some of it down the gullet of Caliban and termed him sort of an alcoholic slave. It's the rum and Indians and so on in North America, and so it's uncannily like some of our own recent history. And it works. Caliban becomes, he worships these white men, these gods that stand there in front of him. And but as he gets more and more involved in the plot and so on, he realizes they're fools, and he's great fool to subscribe to their. So he submits at the end of the play and says he will try to be wise hereafter. So Prospero leaves him alone. This, by the way, is an interesting sort of comment on the whole, what's become very interesting in recent Tempest criticism. It's also relevant to this question about the island as Utopia, which is the debate as to whether the play is anti-colonialist. Prospero is a colonialist, and in some ways he obviously is. He talks about Caliban as his slave. Now he also talks about Ariel as his slave. So that seems to be an important qualification of that. Slave meaning someone involved in unwilling service without recourse to be able to be released from those obligations. That's very explicit about Ariel. Ariel's there for a period of days. He will, now they finally agree in a contract, he will do everything Prospero wants him to do, and then, but his payoff will be he's to be released at the end, and that's what happens at the end of the play, right? That Prospero releases Ariel, and he also says goodbye to Caliban. And they're to go back to Italy, where Prospero says that every third thought shall be my grave. Not every thought, but every third thought. He realizes he's coming close to the end of his life. That's another thing that invites one to think about this play as a sort of a farewell to the stage from the point of view of Shakespeare through Prospero, who after all is a playwright. He's the playwright who writes the script for what happens on this island. But he's, what will that be like? Well, there is some talk of, when the phrase brave new world comes in, this is Miranda who says, oh, brave new world, when she sees all these people in it that she's never seen before. And that phrase, of course, got by Aldous Huxley with deep irony to suggest how the brave new world can turn out to be full of terrible pitfalls. And I think that's true in this play. That I think we're left with a sense that we're not going to know the extent to which history will start repeating itself, or perhaps we should say perhaps we do know, perhaps we know that history does repeat itself and there will be other palace overthrows, and so on. What do we have left? Well, what we have left, of course, is the vision of the artist. And that's again where I think that's the strongest sense in which it seems to me this play is utopian, like Thomas More's Utopia, like his other models here. Let's say a few words and I must stop about Prospero as stage magician. The island, and what is the island, right? In these terms. It's nice to see these analogies to other models set across the Atlantic, and there is that. On the other hand, it's not clearly across the Atlantic, because the ship that goes to Tunis and then back to Italy can't be going over to the coast of Virginia. People have wondered, is the island supposed to be Corsica or Sardinia or something like that? Well, that doesn't work out terribly well, but of course it brings up models again of, for example, of the Odyssey, in which you have imagined islands and imagined places. Certainly Plato's Republic is an imagined kind of floating island, which is both someplace and no place. So there are echoes in the play about talking about Bermuda and the sources that Shakespeare consulted to be able to write this play. But there is the sense in which this island is what? It's the theater. What happens is as contrasted with the mainland, and the mainland, which is all in the past, but then in the immediate future, we hope a remedied and improved future, but we're not sure. We know in the past it's been a place of political overthrow, dog eat dog, and you have to be careful. And if you're too much of a philosopher and trusting people and so on, you may end up dead or just as bad. The island of the Tempest, Prospero can control just about everything. He is in control of the storms, he controls the plot, and he enjoys playing people on a kind of string, deceiving them. Why does he withhold from Alonso the knowledge that his son is in fact not drowned until the very last scene of the play? Well, one nice reading, it seems to me at least, is he wants Alonso to go through a process of purgation, of sorrow, of recognition that what he did deserved what's happened to him. And then at the end of the play can have his son restored to him, well, that's very nice. And as a matter of fact, there's even potentially a kind of autobiographical note there, as there's a way of Shakespeare who lost his only son quite some decade before, so fantasizing about the idea, as he does in As You Like It, of a lost son who turns out not to be lost after all, who's brought back from the grave in a kind of a dream. The play is very dreamlike, of course. It's filled with fantasies of spirits who never walk on the earth in the real world that we know, but it's a place where Prospero can perform magic of the sort. And in a negative way, too. He's like a playwright, and he's very austere. He's very bossy. He throws people around. He loves to deceive people. He deceives his poor daughter into thinking that he's going to reject her possibilities of marrying Ferdinand. Why is he doing that? Well, he explains to us. He steps aside at each point and he says, well, I'm doing this because I want them to be careful about this. And I couldn't be more happy. I found the perfect young man. I see they love each other. I'm going to give them a test, and I'm going to play the role of the forbidding father, which of course it turns up in all the earlier plays, all the way back to Plautus and Terence and so on, and the ancient Greeks and so on, to have a careful father like Aegeus in *Midsummer Night's Dream*, who does this to play a role, which is what you expect to have. You have to have complications in a romantic comedy. You don't want everything to be smooth sailing. It has to go over hurdles in order to be able to come to a happy resolution and untying of the knot. And so Prospero orchestrates all these ingredients, where people enter, where they exit, what they know and what they don't know, and in the process she shows them scenes to themselves which make them have to consider their own question of their own sinfulness, as when a table appears where the harpy comes in and talks about you men of sin, and then snatches the food away from them and so on. Marvelous theater, but also a wonderful way of kind of a testing. And it works arguably with Alonso. Alonso is finally so happy to have his son back and realizes that he's been given a kind of a second chance. That's a very nice vision, isn't it? He was made to suffer the sins of his own political ambition and conniving and so on, and then be forgiven because he has repented. With Antonio, it's very different. Antonio is the brother who took away the dukedom, and the one that Prospero really cannot abide for the most. I mean, it was, after all, it was murder. It was like Claudius and Hamlet. What are you going to do with that? At one point, he says, at the very last scene of the play, he says, "Well, as for you, my brother, I forgive you, villain though thou art." and it's very interesting to think what forgiveness means. Well, it means at least a kind of a pardon, right? He's not going to be punished. I think, for practical terms, you can say, Prospero is saying, I'm not going to, when we get back to Milan, I'm not going to put you in jail or seem to have you executed for attempted murder, but I might keep my eye on you, because Antonio in the final scene makes it clear that he is quite unreconstructed. This is rather all amazing that this happened and so on, but he's still the same villainous person that he was. So the magic of the island doesn't work on everybody the same way. And it doesn't, as art itself does not work for all of us, right? And the relationship between the world of art, the world of dramatic representation, and the real world is this unstable but magical one in which we are shown pictures of ourselves, and it, in some ways it changes everything, and in other ways it changes nothing at all, right? Life is going to go on. We can imagine that there will be more political overthrows. There are bound to be. We know from history that there will be. But you have that vision. In a way, and I want to make a very careful, not push it too far, interesting kind of analogy to Christianity, too, where you get that idea that my kingdom is not of this world in the New Testament, and that what religion can offer is a new vision which changes everything, and then we know in some ways that life is going to go on with the same failure and same sinfulness and criminality that it has since the beginning of time. So it's a beautifully large vision appropriate for dramatic artists, and one I think that's especially wonderful for Prospero. And it's in that sense, I think, that Prospero is in this play a kind of a presider over a utopia on this island of the Tempest. He doesn't use that term. I don't think he knew the work of Thomas More at all, but it makes for a wonderful way, I think, of accounting for what happens in this play. So thank you all very much. Good. Good. Thank you. Thank you. And if we do have a few minutes, if anyone would like to ask questions, please, anybody feel free to go. But yes, sir. The question is, if it's autobiographical, what is Prospero's asking for forgiveness amount to? And I would say, in the largest sense, we all have things we have to be sorry for. And he's been very rough with people. He could have perhaps done things more smoothly than he, in fact, did. But he's going to. And he knows that he's going on to die. Another way of thinking about the autobiographical that makes a lot of sense to me. He talks about what he has to accomplish in this play is to introduce his daughter and get her married off properly. Well, that's a very difficult thing for a man to do. And the play suggests that Prospero feels that kind of pang that some fathers feel of losing a daughter, that it's heartrending, and it's something he can't. But in this play, and you can go back in the earlier plays of Shakespeare, and so the romantic comedies especially, see again and again where fathers are reluctant to do that, or adamant. Shylock would be a very good example in The Merchant of Venice. And where there the story is tragic. His daughter Jessica has to leave and take up a new life because her father is just sort of unregenerate in her terms. So it's nice that at the end of his career he has not only a superb theatrical figure, but as a father, he's someone who's not only agreed that he's going to marry his daughter, he's going to take it all in hand. He arranges the whole thing. He finds the young man, he makes sure they're going to be happy, presides over, and then he says, well, I'm going to go back and every third thought will be my grave. So he's preparing for, the other thing I haven't really touched on, there wasn't time for it, this is also a play about laying down his art as a stage magician and so on. He talks about drowning his books and so on. That I think hits on the same note of sort of regret. In fact, that's probably a better answer than what I've suggested before. Has he been close to daring in causing storms? He compares himself to Medea in the last act and so on. He doesn't use that term, Medea, but he quotes from Golding's translation of the Metamorphoses, that version of the story about Medea. And that's a rather awesome figure to conjure up in these terms and to be compared to. But Medea is there described as someone, again, who can do things like taking the moon out of its sphere. Well, that's rather hubristic, isn't it, to think of moving the moon out of its sphere. So there's something very close to hubristic in what this artist, this magician, has done. And the age was full of thoughts about how do you draw the line between black magic and white magic. Now, that's very important in this play, because clearly Sycorax is an example of black magic. And Prospero is clearly white magic, but then is there something too daring and transgressive about what he's... So, nice apologetic view. Shakespeare very good about apologizing about theater. He obviously knew he was pretty good at it, but he sees that theater can be very, very intrusive and very aggressive in that kind of way, and it's a wonderful question. Another thing it's suggesting to me here, it's the great topic in the Middle Ages, getting from Chaucer and on down through Bach, for example, the apology at the end of one's life, the mea culpa, that saying that what Chaucer in effect says, I apologize for the fact that I wrote all these profane stories, and I should have written more of the Knight's Tale, or these edifying treatises and so on. Well, I hope Chaucer didn't really think that, but it's a topic for it, and because in a deeply Christian culture, that is, as you prepare to meet your Maker, that is one move you can take, which is I want to admit that some of the things I did were rather worldly. That's Bach's Art of the Fugue is sometimes interpreted that way, because especially the last ones in the Art of the Fugue are modeled on BACH. So that it's about the great things that Bach was able to achieve, and this is, again, as with the the Tempest, it seems to me, the great late artist coming up with a demonstration of the things that he's done so well. Well, to do that is wonderful, but then it's obviously pride is deeply buried in that boast. So to at the one hand to say, well, it really was the work of the Almighty, or I'm so glad to be able to go on my knees and apologize before the world and especially before my Maker for the things, any of the arrogant things I may have done. Any other suggested question topics? Well, yes, please.
Following on that, what do you think that we as an audience are supposed to conclude about art? Given that, are we supposed to conclude that it's intrusive force, that there's a bigger meaning about it?
Very nice, especially dramatic art. What view are we to take of dramatic art? On the whole, I think very much a triumphant demonstration. This is what it can do. And then also defining where its limitations are, that the island of the Tempest is not the real world. It's not going to be able to correct social injustices in a simple way at all. In fact, some things won't change in any way, but we'll have this vision which will remain, an unstable revision which will remain for us, and that ought to be healthy. Now, if there's a danger of the artist vaunting himself too greatly, in terms I was just saying, then that also would be something that you could worry about in art. So the artist needs to be humble, and Shakespeare is able to be both. That wonderful opening of Henry V, where for a muse of fire and so on, said we are taking kings across the seas, and but how can we dare on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so vast an object? Can we cram within this wooden boat the very casks of air? Pardon me, we're doing this with a few actors on stage. You're going to have to help us out. You're a part of the imaginative experience. If you're not helping us to imagine that this is the field of Agincourt with thousands of soldiers and bowmen shooting arrows and so on, that this play isn't going to work. That drama is very limited in terms of what it can accomplish and needs that kind of participation. Please.
It seems to me that there are some themes that you pointed out, that on the other side there are other plays that look at the contrast. Mm-hmm. There's the philosopher king who fails because he's too detached, right, and we see that in a lot of plays. We also see the paranoid king who fails because he's too suspicious, such as in Cymbeline and in King John and in perhaps Claudius in Hamlet. Yes. And in Henry IV Part 1, yep, where the king is paranoid about anything that attacks him. And there are characters who are trying to find the balance. Hamlet, in a sense, is trying to find the balance between being the philosopher king and being the practical politician. And I think in some sense Hal is doing the same thing, looking for that balance. Sure. But is there something that is Prospero himself looking for the balance because he failed originally as a prince and realizes it?
Well, that's a very interesting comparison. I agree with everything you're saying about Hamlet and about Prince Hal and so on. I think that's wonderfully put. This play, the focus is more on the artist, so that the finding a political philosopher king balance really doesn't come up so much. It clearly is. There is in the story of how he's left himself vulnerable back in the bad old days in Milan to the insinuations of his brother and so on, that there is clearly a contest between philosophy and a wise ruler would be very well advised to think about that. But it's not as though Prospero goes back saying, well, I know I'm going to do this right next time. I'm going to be more careful, and I'll have bodyguards, and I'm not going to let this sneak up on me again. So I think he's moved on to a different problem more of what to make of how art mediates all of this in terms of the sense of relationship between art and the real world. And there, again, seems to very strongly wants to make a case for art, even while admitting that it belongs to its own sphere and not to the world of practical. Nice, thank you, nice question. Well, let's see, we should, yes, I think perhaps we should, if you have more questions, please come talk. I'd love to. Thank you all so much for coming. This was great.